Here now with his take on the Synod on Synodality 2023 is one half of the Papal Posse, the esteemed editor-in-chief of the CatholicThing.org, Robert Royal. Bob, thanks for being with us again. First off, your reaction to what you just heard from Gerhard Cardinal Mueller, anything that stood out?
Well, one of the things I like about him in particular is the way that he points out that a lot of what the discussion was, he didn't go into a lot of detail about that, but it's very superficial, and it's kind of designed to be that way, that if you start to dig into any serious issues, then you have to make substantive decisions. And instead, I think what largely happened, if there is a positive outcome from this session of the Synod, is that a lot of people got to know one another. They learned that people had different positions, but it did not dig deeply into Catholicism. It did not provide us with a kind of a launching pad. If the goal is in this Synod to make the Church more effective evangelically, going out into the world, and to make the way that the Church is governed internally more efficient and closer to the Spirit of Christ, I don't think that there was a lot of that. I think that most of the people that I spoke to, I know I felt exhausted by the end. And several of the people that I spoke with, including several bishops, felt basically the same. There were people, I think, who just had never been in something like this before and were energized by it. But my general take is kind of what the Cardinal said, that we pretty much know the contours of Catholicism after all this time. And the attempt to use this Synod to change it in some way still seems to me to be very much up in the air.
Well, Bob, look, the upshot, I think, was clearly articulated this week by two U.S. cardinals. They returned from the Synod, and they started advocating for lay participation in all future synods. Cardinal Robert McElroy said, we'll put it on the screen, it would seem impossible to go back now, he says. It would be wrenching to go back if you just had bishops there or just bishops voting, end quote. Then Cardinal Blaise Cupich of Chicago added, we all have authority, and that means we all have something to say, end quote. Your take on what's happening here, Bob? It sounds like they're lobbying hard to enshrine this as a new dogma, this synodal lay participation approach at a time when they're trying to shake loose belief in most dogmas. But go ahead, your thoughts.
Yeah, look, they keep denying over and over again that this is an attempt to democratize the Church, but it's clear that that's the direction that it's headed in. And if you want to set up a body, some sort of consultative body, which they did try to do, it was rejected in the final votes or somehow in the transition to the final document. But there was an attempt to kind of suggest that there should be kind of a permanent synod in play and active. That was not voted on and not approved in the final document. But look, if you want to have consultations with other people that include bishops, that's fine. But as the Cardinal mentioned over and over again, the apostolic tradition is that people who have been specially trained, ordained, and then appointed to govern the Church, these are the bishops in communion with the Holy Father are apostolically the people who've been designated in our entire tradition by how to conduct the business of the Church. They can accept advice. They can consult with other people. There's nothing wrong with people getting together to discuss things. But the idea that somehow this has changed the entire history of the Catholic Church, well, these are two American cardinals who have their opinions. But I don't think that their opinions necessarily have to become the rule for the universal Church in the world.
Bob, you were in Rome for the entire Synod. What do you make of that synodal hangover being felt by progressives in the wake of what they're calling a disappointing summary document because it failed to explicitly mention LGBT issues and women's ordination and end of priestly celibacy, et cetera?
Well, look, I wouldn't jump to too many conclusions. Yes, there were a lot of people. Sister Janine Gramick of New Ways Ministries said she was disappointed because it essentially left the hierarchy in place to run the Church. And people, I think, of that ilk, generally speaking, were disappointed. I myself don't believe that all these issues have gone away. I was glad that the term LGBT was removed from the document. I've been saying that when you use what is essentially an ideological acronym, LGBT, it's like giving the other team the ball on your 5-yard line and then you're scrambling to line up for defense. You've already conceded that there's this entity which doesn't even exist consistently in itself. There are lots of lesbians who don't like what trans is doing to their status as women. There are male homosexuals who don't like trans. This is a mirage. And so for that not to have appeared is good, but I think that it didn't appear because they knew there would be very strong opposition to including it in the final document. Whether it will come back next year, we don't know. It's interesting that the chapters on women, on deaconesses, et cetera, got the most negative votes. Out of a group of about 350 delegates, there were over 60, even over 65 in a couple instances, of opposition to those paragraphs. So they're not there in the final document. The progressives didn't get what they want. But I also don't think that they're gone for good, and we may see them not even only next October, but I think in the interim year that we have between now and next year, I think we're going to see those return in subtle and not so subtle ways.
Cardinal Cupich was interviewed by America Magazine, and he was asked if he was surprised that there wasn't more of a specific LGBT reference in the document. He said there were some very compelling testimonies on the part of people about that in terms of their families. That was not fully reflected in the document. That doesn't mean we're not going to return to it next year. I think that's going to happen. I would say this, the discussions about the LGBTQ community, there was greater discussion about that than polygamy, and polygamy was named in the document. And it was not a universal problem. And an issue like the gay and lesbian community would be. That's the end quote from Blaise Cupich. What do you make of the Cardinals' rationale there? And very quickly, do you think it will return next year? It sounds like he's planning on having it on his dance card.
Yeah, we think that the same group of people is going to be invited back. It may be supplemented. It looks like there's some noises coming out of the Vatican that they may add some other people. But look, I would say this. They talk a lot about experience. So they talk about the experience of families with LGBT people and how heart-wrenching it is that they're not entirely accepted by the church. I would put this in another direction, and I didn't see anything like this in the final document. What about the families in a country like ours here in the United States and also in Europe, where LGBT ideologies are being imposed on children in schools, and children who think that they want to transition to a different gender, they're being told not to tell their parents, and it's being hidden from parents. So there's another group of people, parents, who have a different set of experiences that were not invited to this synod. And I think if we want to be really honest and sincere about what's going on in society, if we're in a different epoch now, as the Pope seems to be promoting, well, we need to look at those threats to Catholic families as well as the openness to others.
Yeah, Bob, for all the talk of peripheries, it seems the mindset of this synod was really shaped in the West. An African bishop present at the synod told the National Catholic Register's Ed Penton this. We'll put it on the screen. Another contribution that Africa brought up within this synod was our view on the teaching of the Church on the human person and human sexuality. In Africa, we understand marriage as a union between a man and a woman, and anything short of that is witchcraft. This is something we said very strongly. That was Bishop Andrew Nkea Fayana of Cameroon. Bob, your thoughts? This bishop, like so many others, got no press coverage. We didn't hear from this bishop.
Well, I mean, the secular press is going to avoid voices like that. They want to magnify the voices that they like, obviously. Look, I heard very early on, even before the synod began, that African bishops had met in a place that I won't specify because I don't want to get anybody in trouble. But a group of them had met and had agreed among themselves that this LGBT stuff couldn't possibly go forward. And one of the reasons that they put forward is not only the dogmatic and the traditional reasons why we limit sexuality to within marriage. They said that the evangelicals And the Muslims were just waiting in Africa for the Catholic Church to become unfaithful on those issues, and then they could then make great strides forward among the African people because they would know that that first world sexuality was wrong. So even if we're talking about evangelizing in Africa, this would be a terrible misstep.
At the final Mass of this synod, the first part of it, the Pope said something that sounded to me like he was trying to let progressives down lightly, lower expectations, if you will. Here's what the Pope said. This is the final closing Mass. We may have plenty of good ideas on how to reform the Church, but let us remember to adore God and to love our brothers and sisters with His love. That is the great and perennial reform. End quote. Bob, like President Obama, who once said after 8 years in office, you are the change you've been waiting for, what are you hearing here?
Well, I thought that was a very good statement. It seems to me that if we make that the focus, then we're Catholic. And when we adore God and we love our neighbor, we do it in a specific way, though. We don't do it in the way that the world thinks that we should when it thinks about God. We don't look at God the way the world looks at it. We don't look at it the way certain Protestant groups. I mean, I actually saw a Protestant group in which a female minister was talking about the God of pronouns. We have a specific content that I think the Cardinal was getting at, that there's been a revelation, and we begin not with our own ideas about God and our own ideas about what it means to love a neighbor, but we begin with what God has communicated to us and what we try to follow. So I think that was a very good step. I don't know, whether it was directed to the progressives who felt disappointed or whether it was a bone thrown to people who are more traditional, but I'm glad that he said it.
Bob, I want to get your take on a new motu proprio from Pope Francis this week. It's entitled To Promote Theology. The Pope is calling for a paradigm shift in Catholic theology, as I mentioned to Cardinal Mueller. He speaks about opening the Church up to the world and to humanity, quote, with its problems, its wounds, its challenges, its potential. Theological reflection is therefore called to a courageous cultural revolution, which requires a fundamentally contextual theology. Now, Bob, how do we unpack this? Cultural revolution seems like a loaded term, coming as it does from the Communist playbook. And what of a contextual theology? What does this mean?
Well, it just came out today, and it's only in Italian. I read it this morning kind of quickly, knowing that we'd be talking about it today. But look, in some ways, the document is fine. It talks about engaging all the questions that exist at our moment. I mean, this is something that Thomas Aquinas did, that Joseph Ratzinger did in their day. That part of it is nothing new. And the impression that the document kind of gives is that we haven't done this before in the Church is simply false. We've always done this. What worries me about this contextual theology is it sounds a lot like situation ethics to me, or situation theology, because as I said earlier, everybody has experiences. People have experiences of problems with their children who may be LGBT. People have problems with their children are being catechized by LGBT. Experiences in and of themselves don't give us answers. What we need are principles and the connection with God's revelation, as I was talking about earlier. And it seems to me that this contextualization is a move away from that. It reminds me in a kind of a general way of the old the liberation theology, where there's this kind of uprising from below that is going to define theology. The Pope very often in his papacy has kind of expressed disdain for real theology. In that document, he talks about we don't want a theology of the desk, that this sort of academic theology.
Right.
But we need both of those things. We need to be able to pay attention to where we are culturally, what problems people are experiencing, but at the same time, we need that I would say unique Catholic ability to combine faith and reason, that we can probe into every question that there is with the reasonable powers God has given us and in the light of the faith. And insofar as we do that, we will be Catholic. Insofar as we accept the context as the primary thing that we should look to, I think we're starting to move away from where we ought to be.
Bob, there are new developments in that bombshell story of the diocesan reinstatement of disgraced artist and former Jesuit priest Marko Rupnik. He was credibly accused of the sexual abuse of nuns. As viewers recall, we reported that a Slovenian diocese had accepted him, reincarnated him as a priest in good standing recently. Well, Rupnik's former Jesuit superior is denying that the order facilitated that reinstatement of Rupnik and that the Jesuits, he claims, warned the local bishop about him. The Pope, after a lot of media pressure, including from this program, lifted the statute of limitations on Rupnik and reopened a Vatican investigation of him. Bob, didn't they already do multiple investigations into this guy? What's happening here?
I wish I knew, Raymond. We have a column up at the Catholic Thing today. How is this still happening in the church? I mean, we know that people who are serial abusers, which is what Rupnik seems to be, are very good at manipulating authorities, manipulating the people that they've abused. The Jesuits started a process with him. The Holy Father didn't lift the statute of limitations. And one of the signs that, in my estimation, there's credible guilt there is he wouldn't cooperate with the investigation. Priests I know who have handled these sort of cases say that when a person is cooperative, it kind of gives you a certain confidence that they're innocent. They want to get the truth out there. He wouldn't cooperate. The Jesuits eventually threw him out because he was disobedient to his superiors. And suddenly he shows up in his home country and is accepted into one of their dioceses, and even the other bishops in Slovenia have kind of distanced themselves from this. So somebody was massaging this process. I think at this stage we don't know who it is. It's good that the Holy Father, admittedly under pressure, finally lifted the statute of limitations. And I'm really waiting to see how it is that at this late stage in our understanding of abuse in the church, this man, who some of the things are just utterly eye-popping, what he did and tried to do, how he was able to become a priest in good standing again.
Well, yeah, and he's and we do know he has very deep Vatican contacts and is a friend of the Pope's. Now, Bob, the Pope also touched on this subject of abuse in a blockbuster interview on Italian TV. And I think it's appropriate to discuss this in conjunction with the Rupnik saga. A lot of cleaning was done, the Pope says here. They concerned all cases of abuse, and even some from the Curia were sent away. Pope Ratzinger was courageous in this. He took that problem into his own hands and took many steps and then handed it over to finish. This goes on. Abuse, whether of conscience, sexual abuse, or anything else, must not be tolerated. It is contrary to the gospel. That's the end of the quote there. It won't be tolerated, but it has been tolerated, Bob. As recently as last week, and in the case of the Pope personally, Archbishop Zanchetta and Barros, and I mean, I can keep going down the list, I won't. But why is there a capacity, if you will, an undue mercy for these kind of rabid abusers in the church?
Yeah, look, his words were very good. His actions have been, let's say, they're spotty, because you rightly say, it isn't as if just one or two of people who were close to him were given special treatment. Zanchetta was actually removed from Argentina, and a special job was made for him inside one of the financial offices in the Vatican, which was just mind-boggling when he was under investigation.
Right.
So it's clear that this Pope would like to clean up abuse. I don't doubt his sincerity about that. But when it comes to individuals, especially individuals he knows, I think his emotionalism tends to take over, and he doesn't want to believe it, and then even allows things to happen institutionally that cast doubt on his own credibility as a person who really wants to clean things up.
Yeah, well, and he is right. Ratzinger was tenacious and courageous in this way. I mean, he removed like 3,000 priests in the course of his tenure at the CDF. Well, Bob, it's being reported that Pope Francis will travel to Dubai in December to personally address a UN climate change summit. Now, one assumes he's going to be raising his carbon footprint by flying to Dubai from Rome, but I'll put that aside. Why is this an important issue for the Church now? And how does this dovetail with that recent apostolic exhortation, got very little coverage, Laudato Deum, which was released a couple of months ago, the Pope's most recent exhortation on the environment?
Yeah, look, he's made this one of the centerpieces of his papacy, and there's nothing wrong with having a concern for what he calls our common home. My concern about what he's been doing is that he seems to go to the most radical interpreters of environmentalism. Look, these are hard questions, these hard trade-offs that have to take place when we deal with the environment. We obviously still need energy. We still need to be able to produce food. We can't just disrupt our electrical grids to try to use renewable power sources. We need sober, prudent people reflecting on those things. When his first encyclical, Laudato Si, came out, the panel that presented it was unbelievably radical to the left. You know, you had ecofeminists, you had a man who wanted to reduce the human population to 1 billion on the face of the earth. And this Laudate Deum, the most recent document, has been widely criticized by people who know the details of the environmental debate and say that it's making a case that also undermines its own credibility because it makes claims that even the best analysts don't have. Look, he's going to go there. He's going to make some statement. It's a good thing to bring some people together to recognize God's creation and the need to care for it. I just wish he would be a little bit more careful in who he engages with and who he has write some of these documents for him.
Bob, I'm going to leave it here because I want to tie a bow around the Synod. The Pope says that this Synod was precisely what was envisioned by Paul VI. Is that your take on this? I mean, especially considering the way we heard from Cardinal Mueller. He got 3 minutes in a month to speak. 1 month, 3 minutes before the assembly. The stymieing of the expression of bishops for these kind of pre-programmed layman lectures, is that the vision of Paul VI for a bishop synod?
Well, look, we've talked about this before, and some of the Eastern Catholic prelates have said quite openly that this is not a synod in either the sense that the Eastern Church has understood it, and we were told we're recovering that tradition, nor is it what Paul VI envisioned. Paul VI envisioned a college of bishops coming together to help him, inform him, make some decisions about what needs to happen in the Church. I myself have noticed that they are talking about the assembly a lot rather than, emphasis on the word synod. And I kind of wish they would go in that direction. If we had some kind of consultative assembly, that wouldn't give the impression that the people who were there somehow by the fact of being baptized Catholics have a right to run the Church. That's not how we understand things. Vatican II actually had the notion that lay people should go out into the world and evangelize, right, and in their workplaces and in their recreation, et cetera, bring the Church there. Not lay people coming into the Church to kind of do what the clerics are already doing. So I think that it's the opposite of the truth.
No. Bob, we will leave it there. Thank you, as always, for your commentary, your insights. And you can read more, hear more at thecatholicthing.org. Bob has all his commentary there. Thank you, Bob.
My pleasure, Raymond.